while I try to work out sharing it sa BSP Facebook page. Okay lang po. I can do it in the background naman.
Okay. So, shall I start na?
Gusto niyo, Camille? Kasi 15 pa lang po yung 48 po yung registered. Do you want to wait 5 more minutes? Ma'am Corina, okay lang po ba sa inyo? Ayan, pumapasok-pasok na sila.
My connection was temporarily lost. This is the problem with this monopoly. Cannot use video, okay?
Oo nga. Hindi po namin naman masyadong napansin pa, Ma'am Corina.
Ganon, sige. Ay, teka.
Sige. Siguro, Dr. Mendoza, maybe 3 more minutes, 10:05. Ayan, 22 na. So, I think they're coming in na. Okay lang po ba, Ma'am Corina?
Sure. Teka,
10:05,
no.
Dr. Mendoza, ha?
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Okay, let's start. Good morning, everyone, especially to our colleagues from the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. My name is Adrian Mendoza, School of Economics, and I will be your moderator for this morning. So welcome to the BSP-UP Professorial Chair Lecture of Professor Maria Socorro Bautista. So before we proceed, let me introduce our speaker. Today's lecture will be conducted by Dr. Maria Socorro Bautista, who is the BSP Sterling Chair Professor of Monetary Economics. She's a member of the UPSE faculty. She received a BA in Economics from Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts, USA, and a PhD in Economics from Columbia University. And she has published widely in the areas of monetary economics and open economy macroeconomics. And of course, she is one of the leading economists in the country. To present her lecture on monetary policy shocks, firm-level financing decisions, and growth, let us all welcome Dr. Maria Socorro Bautista. Ma'am Corina.
Thank you, Adrian. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here today to deliver my BSP Professorial Chair Lecture, which has been postponed for the last 2 years, I think, because of this pandemic. And I'm also happy to see that some former students of mine are in the audience. Of course, Laura and Faith and Hazel. So I'm happy to be here, and so let me begin my lecture. The title of this paper is "Monetary Policy Shocks, Firm-Level Financing Decisions, and Growth." Okay, and whoops, ito na. All right. Basically, I got into this topic because I noticed different but related strands of literature, with one strand of literature focusing on the nexus between finance and growth. For example, the role of financial development and financing constraints on innovation, investment, and growth. And another strand of the literature, which is sort of related to this broader literature on the nexus between finance and growth, but more specifically dealing with the link between monetary policy shocks and the bank lending channel, or the channel through which we think monetary policy affects the economy, and even more particularly on this relationship between the presence or absence of a bank lending channel and the way by which firms decide on a financing mix. So if I look at the literature on the nexus between finance and growth, the broad sort of literature on that, there are good articles by King and Levine, which sort of summarize many of the papers on the role of financial development in facilitating capital accumulation and technological innovation. Of course, way back in 1912, Schumpeter already wrote about the role of banks in the adoption of new technologies. In 1998, Rajan and Singales did a study that found that industries that are more reliant on external finance grow faster in countries with more developed financial systems, And evidence for this was found in a 1998 study by Demirgo, Kunt, and Maximovich at the firm level. There was another more study after that by Fisman and Love, which found that financial development reduces the reliance of corporate investment on internal funds. In a 2014 paper, some colleagues and I found, did a paper on the role of financial development and financial constraints on firm level investment demand. And basically, we used a cash sensitivity of a firm's demand curve, investment demand as a proxy for the degree of external financing constraints faced by a firm. And we found that financial conditions affect firms' growth opportunities and investment demand, while financial development primarily affects firms' external financing constraints. And then in two more recent papers, Sarah Daway-Ducanes and I looked at the relationship between the size of the financial sector and the effect on manufacturing and services growth when there is financial expansion. We found that in general, for a group of countries, not just the Philippines, there seems to be too little finance. It's not, the financial sector is not large enough, of a scale large enough to actually benefit from financial expansion. And in another paper, a more recent one, we looked at which aspects of financial market development matter for services sector growth versus manufacturing sector growth. And we find that financial market and financial institutions depth matter more for the growth of the services sector, while both of these and financial market access matter more for manufacturing growth. Now, the related literature, the other strand of literature that I looked at is more closely related to what this paper is about. This paper actually came as a follow-up to an earlier paper of mine where I examined a possible bank lending channel. But this literature goes beyond the narrow bank lending channel and considers a wider credit channel. Now, this bank lending channel literature was started by King in 1986. I mean, the studies on the bank lending channel. King had this 1986 paper that looked for evidence of a bank lending channel by examining correlations among monetary policy changes, bank loans, and output. However, the criticism, this sort of approach has been criticized for failing to distinguish between loan demand versus loan supply effects in response to a monetary policy shock. So, when there's a monetary policy shock, and you look at the bank lending channel, is it working from the demand for bank loans or the supply of bank loans? It's not clear in this sort of studies of King and others. So the Kashup, Stein, and Wilcox paper in 1993 attempted to resolve this identification problem by positing that the effect of tighter monetary policy, for example, would be for a firm to substitute away from bank loans and instead raise its commercial paper issuance rather than simply reduce all sources of finance. And this is in fact what Kashup, Stein, and Wilcox find. Okay, so the firm tends to substitute away from bank loans and raise commercial paper issuance instead of reducing all sources of finance when there's tighter monetary policy. Now, but this approach of Kashyap, Stein, and Wilcox was questioned by Oliver and Rudebush and the other papers that came after Oliver and Rudebush, because the Kashyap, Stein, and Wilcox paper fails to distinguish between large and small firms, and implicitly assumes, Kashyap, Stein, and Wilcox implicitly assume that small firms can use other sources of external finance, such as commercial paper issuance, as easily as large firms can. And since we know that that is not really what happens in real life, Oliver and Rudebush then say that Kashyap, Stein, and Wilcox failed to capture the true effects of changes in the mix of external financing across different types of firms, and thus misidentify the channel by which bank loans decline. And because of that, they consider a much wider credit channel operating through total credit or credit from various sources and not just bank loans. So Oliver and Rudebush examine whether the mix of financing changes following a monetary policy shock. And what they find is evidence, unlike Kashyap, Stein, and Wilcox, that a monetary contraction does not change the mix of financing, but instead shifts lending to large firms and away from small firms. Now, however, since large firms are not typically as reliant on bank loans as small firms are, what happens is that there's an overall decline in bank loans following a monetary contraction. But this is not what the bank lending channel defines as a bank lending channel. Okay, so it's simply because when there's a monetary contraction, the lending shifts to large firms, but because large firms are not very reliant on bank loans, it looks like the supply of bank loans has dropped, which would be what would happen under the bank lending channel. But this is not what's happening here. It's not because of the bank lending channel. Okay, it's simply because lending to large firms it's shifted to the banks shift lending to large firms and away from small firms, but the large firms are not that reliant on bank loans, so bank loans drop. Okay, and the Chodoro, Wright, Darmuni, Luck, and Closure, as well as the Greenwald, Granier, and Paul papers examine how different types of finance are affected by monetary policy shocks, and they do find a broader credit line lending channel in which bank credit line drawdowns are a source of different redistributive effects between large and small firms, even when overall credit grows in an economy. And to find this kind of evidence, these studies use supervisory firm level loan data, which obviously are not available to me, much as I would have liked to actually do a similar kind of study. So, because if you have supervisory firm level loan data, then you can match bank loan provision to specific large and small firms and observe the extent to which the treatment by banks in terms of amount of credit lines given, maturity of credit at origination, etc., differ between large and small firms, as well as how different types of firms react to changes in the price and quantity of bank loans and other types of external finance when monetary policy changes. All right, so given that I don't have this very detailed supervisory firm level loan data to match bank borrowers and the banks that are lending to these particular firms, I have I guess a more humble sort of aim, but sort of the flavor of the study is along the lines of the Oliver and Rudebush and the other studies that came after Oliver and Rudebush. So I basically want to ask, how, if at all, do monetary policy shocks affect firm level financing decisions? And so the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to examine the effects of monetary policy shocks on non-bank firm level financing decisions while considering a broader credit channel. Specifically, I want to examine the effects of monetary policy shocks on various financing choices of listed firms to see whether these financing choices vary by sector and by size of firm. Okay, so in terms of the data, what kind of data are available to me? I have firm level financial statement panel data set of listed firms, only listed firms, from 2000 to 2019 from DataStream. Okay, so all I have are financial statements of listed firms in 18 sectors. And these sectors are chemical and chemical products, crude oil, natural gas, and condensate, construction, conglomerates or holding companies, telecom, real estate, electric power, radio, TV and communications equipment, non-bank finance, recreational, sporting, cultural, and sporting activities, food and beverage, storage, and services incidental to transport, hotels and restaurants, water utilities, mining, transportation, miscellaneous, not otherwise classified, and media. Okay, and I selected 20 what I call financial variables or financing or sources of finance, financing for firms, including cash, total debt, short-term debt. This is debt that's due with a maturity of 1 year or less, including the portion of long-term debt that is due, under 1 year. And then I have long-term debt, long-term borrowing, total sources of financing, which includes all sources, internal and external to the firm. The increase or a decrease in short-term borrowing, which is defined as the increase or decrease in short-term borrowings from 1 year to the next, as reported in the cash flow statement. And then I have the reduction in long-term debt, okay, which represents funds that are used to reduce long-term debt, capitalized lease obligations, and includes a decrease in debt from the conversion of debentures into common stock. All right. Proceeds from sales of common and preferred stock, retained earnings, and then I created ratios, like the ratio of cash to total sources of financing. Remember, total sources of financing include all internal and external sources. And so I created all these ratios, the ratio of long-term debt to total sources of financing, short-term debt to total sources of financing, short-term debt to long-term debt, etc. And then number 20 is sort of, I put everything in that wasn't external, because I couldn't find the data for external sources of financing for all the firms. So I put together, you know, in the numerator there, everything that I thought would be sort of internal or internally generated by the firm, and divide as a ratio to this total source of financing, which includes internal and external sources. So these 20 financing variables or financial variables are going to be the dependent variable in the regressions that I'm going to run. But before I talk about that, these are the some descriptive statistics of these for some of these variables by sector in thousand pesos. So these are just, they give you the mean, the standard deviation, min and max of these, some of these basic financial variables for the different sectors. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is, because the literature says there's a difference between the effect of a monetary policy shock on big versus small firms, is to try to find a way to classify big versus small firms among listed firms. Now, already, since the firm is listed, you know, it's typically going to be large anyways. But since I don't have data on unlisted firms, I just recently got some data on unlisted firms, but I haven't looked to see whether the cells are actually have something in them and are not empty. So for now, I'm just using listed firms and trying to make a distinction among listed firms, big versus small firms. And originally, I wanted to look at to use the the capitalization, the size of capitalization as a variable by which to classify firms as big or small. But it turned out that the values for this variable were missing in many of the sectors, and so I used instead the value of total assets. So I looked at the annual median value of total assets of firms in a particular sector. So if this is food and beverage, I looked at the 1 year and I looked at the median value of total assets for all the firms in this sector in that year, and then classified as big. A big firm is a firm whose median value in that year is above the median, and similarly, the firms with smaller median value, smaller total assets, value of total assets relative to the median of firms in that sector in that year would be considered small. And of course, if I have this kind of classification system, then you can already see that it's possible for a firm to be considered big 1 year and small in another year. Okay, but so this is just one way of classifying firms, although it's a bit crude. Okay, so here I just have graphs of the average size of firm assets in the different sectors in million pesos. All right, so this is just pictures of it. And it's very interesting, this gaming and recreation. All of a sudden, you know, in 2013, the average firm assets went up like that. Okay, so this is just some pictures of what the average, not median, average asset firm size looks like. So then what I do is I do these panel OLS regressions with random effects and robust standard errors, where the dependent variable in each of these regressions, in each of these panel regressions, is the one of those, is each of those 20 financial variables that I showed you earlier. And the explanatory variables are the monetary policy shocks. Here I consider the lagged policy rate and the lagged reserve requirement ratio. Then I also have lagged values of monetary growth, lagged values of bank loan growth. These are all lagged values: GDP growth, rate of inflation, VIX, a bank characteristic, lagged return on assets of universal banks, and the crisis dummy for the global financial crisis years of 2008 and 2009. So I have all of these explanatory variables on the right-hand side, and I just put bank loan growth on the right-hand side because I don't really have bank loan data for the individual firms. So I'm treating bank loan here, bank loan growth as a kind of, it's almost like monetary growth or GDP growth. Okay, so it's a variable on the right-hand side. And what I want to do is examine the relationship between each of those dependent financial variables, the 20 that I listed, and the different explanatory variables, using data first for all firms, okay, without for all firms and big and small firms in all sectors. So I aggregate all the big and big firms and small firms in all sectors in the data set. And then I do the same thing using the big and small firms in 4 individual sectors. I look in particular at conglomerates, food and beverage, real estate, and construction. So I kind of wanted to find some manufacturing, real estate, obviously, because it's always important, and some kind of services sector. And of course, I run thousands of regressions, it seems like, but I want to focus only on the coefficients of the lagged policy rate, the lagged reserve requirement ratio, lagged monetary growth, and lagged loan growth. Let's see the effects on firm financial variables. So I'll just show you one typical output. Why is it so slow? Hang on. Okay. So these are the sorts of regressions I ran. All right. So on the columns show you what particular financial variable or financing variable I'm talking about, whether it's for all firms, only for big firms, or for small firms, in this case, in all 18 sectors. Okay, so the columns tell you what the dependent variable is, and the rows tell you the different explanatory variables, and I only highlight the ones that I'm interested in that turn out to be significant. So I'm really looking at M3 growth, reserve requirement, policy rate, and loans growth. And then I put stars. No, I didn't put stars. The stars come from I put in green. I put in green when the coefficient for that particular variable, that particular explanatory variable is significant in the case of small firms. Okay, so this is the output just for firms in 18 sectors. Okay, so let me go back to where I was. All right. So this is exactly what I just said. And if I look at the results, okay, first I will look at the results when I use firms in all sectors. All right. I focus on 4 different explanatory variables. And here I put stars when there is a significant effect on a financial variable for small firms of the particular explanatory variable, in this case, lagged monetary growth. So these are the results when I look at, when I use firms in all sectors, okay? All firms in all sectors, big firms in all sectors, and small firms in all sectors. So the first one tells you the results for monetary growth, the second one for the policy rate, the third one for the reserve requirement, and the fourth for loan growth. Okay, so just by looking at the number of entries on each slide, and the stars that appear indicating an impact on small firms, several things are immediately apparent. Okay. Let me get back to my notes. All right. So it's apparent that the lag policy rate affects the greatest number of financial variables of firms. And this is followed by lag loan growth, and then lag monetary growth, and the lag reserve requirement. Okay. The financial variables of all firms and of big firms are what are affected in practically all cases. And in the few cases where the financial variables of small firms are affected, the coefficients affecting the financial variables of big firms are much larger than that affecting small firms. And so there's a difference, for example, in the effects of the lag change in the lag policy rate on financing decisions as between big versus small firms. So if I look at this particular slide, so cash, long-term borrowing, total debt, long-term and short-term debt, net proceeds from sales of common and preferred stocks, retained earnings, the ratio of long-term to short borrowing to total sources of financing, the ratio of cash dividends to total sources of financing, all decline with a lagged increase in the policy rate in the case of big firms. So in general, an increase in the policy rate tends to reduce the financing, external financing, the financing sources of big firms. The reduction in long-term debt and the ratio of long-term debt to total sources of financing, and the ratio of long-term debt to total sources of financing both increase in response to an increase in the lag policy rate for big firms. So these latter findings indicate that while financing options decline when the policy rate rises, big firms experience an increase in the reduction in long-term debt overall, while the amount of long-term debt to total sources of financing rises, suggesting an increase in the tenor of the debt that big firms avail of. Now, if we look at the financial variables of small firms, you can see that there are very few stars here in this slide, except for 2 notable exceptions. One is the effect of the lag policy rate on the ratio of short-term to long-term debt for small firms, which is significant and positive. All right. But only for small firms. In fact, for large firms, the sign is opposite and not significant. So this indicates a tilt in the maturity of debt toward more short-term debt relative to long-term debt in the case of small firms when the policy rate rises. Another notable exception to the earlier findings for big firms is the ratio of this thing, that long thing on top, the total sources of financing, which is positive and significant for all firms and for small firms when the policy rate increases, while it is negative and not significant in the case of big firms. So this suggests again that small firms tend to rely more on financing that they can generate on their own, almost internally, relative to total sources of financing when the policy rate increases. If I look at lagged loan growth rate, now here you see in this slide, there are more stars, which means that loan growth in general, lagged loan growth has a more universal effect in that it affects the financial variables of small firms in addition to those of big firms and all firms in general. So so basically what do I want to say about this? Not much. So financial variables of big firms alone are affected in a positive and significant way by loan growth, which include long-term borrowing, long-term debt, net proceeds of sales of common preferred stock, etc. All right, but the effect on big firms, on the financial variables of big firms, is larger than that of small firms. If I look at monetary growth, again, it tends to affect all firms. I mean, because small firms are also affected. But what else? What can I say here? The degree of reduction in long-term debt and the ratio of cash dividends to all sources of financing both decline for all firms when monetary growth increases. Lagged monetary growth also reduces the degree of reduction in long-term debt for big firms as well. The ratio of retained earnings to total sources of financing and the ratio of the sum of debt, proceeds from stock issuance, less cash dividends paid, etc., to total sources of financing for all firms both increase with an increase in monetary growth. And I think this implies that firms in general, when you have monetary growth, actually try to build a buffer for a rainy day by retaining more earnings and paying out fewer dividends relative to total financing sources. So that's kind of interesting. And it's also worth noting that lagged monetary growth affects small firms uniquely in that it reduces total debt and long-term debt only in the case of small firms. All right, so nothing much more interesting to say there. If I look at, so in general, the policy rate and the reserve requirement ratio tend to affect the financing variables of big firms more than those, or rather than those of small firms, while loan growth and monetary growth tend to affect the financing variables of both big and small firms more universally. The policy rate, however, has a unique effect on the ratio of short-term to long-term debt of small firms, in that a higher lagged policy rate tilts the maturity of debt towards the short term in the case of small firms. And some results also suggest that small firms tend to rely more on own generated or internally generated financing relative to total financing sources when the policy rate increases. In contrast, big firms experience an increase in the degree of reduction in long-term debt overall, while the amount of long-term debt in total sources of financing rises, suggesting, in contrast with the case of small firms, that big firms tend to have an increase, experience an increase in the tenor of debt when the lagged policy rate rises. Okay, so then I did this, I did the exercise now looking specifically at certain groups of firms. So first, conglomerates, and if I just look through the different results, you could see that for conglomerate firms, again, it's the lag policy rate and the lag loan growth rate that affect the most number of financial variables of conglomerate firms. And again, as in the earlier case of all firms, the effect differed as between big and small firms, with loan growth having more of an influence on the financial variables of big and small firms, while the lag policy rate mostly affects the financial variables of big firms rather than small firms only. So if I look at the effects of an increase in the lag policy rate, it decreases cash, long-term borrowing, total debt, long-term debt, and retained earnings of all firms and of big firms. It also reduces the degree of reduction in long-term debt and increases the ratio of short-term debt to total financing sources, but only for big firms. It increases the ratio of total debt to total sources of financing for all firms. So the only financial variable affected by the lag policy rate for small firms is retained earnings, which declines as it did in the case of big firms. But again, the effect on big firms is much larger than that on small firms. But in general, we can conclude that the change in the policy rate predominantly affects big firms only. Now, if I look at lag loan growth, again, there are more stars here, meaning there are more the financial variables of small firms that are affected. And so I can say that lag loan growth has a more universal effect in that it affects the financial variables of both big and small firms. Retained earnings and the reduction in long-term debt both increase in the cases of all firms and big and small firms, while the ratio of cash dividends to sources of financing for all firms and small firms increases. All right. So this is the only thing that lag monetary growth affects. Okay, so so an increase in lag monetary growth reduces the ratio of cash dividends to sources of financing for all firms, big firms, and small firms. And this finding is the same as that for all firms when all firms in the sample are included. So it seems like whenever there's monetary growth in the previous year, firms generally tend to pay out more cash dividends. Okay. Then I looked at food and beverage firms, okay, food and beverage firms. And again, if I simply look at the number of things that affect the financial variables, the number, which explanatory variable of the four that I'm focusing on, which affects the most number of financial variables in food and beverage firms, this is monetary growth. So overall monetary growth is a variable that affected most of the financial variables, followed by the policy rate, reserve requirement, and Curiously, last is loan growth. Okay. So monetary growth affects, well, an increase in lagged monetary growth reduces total debt, long-term debt, and the ratio of cash to total sources of financing. The ratio of short-term debt to total sources of finance, the ratio of the sum of debt, all that to total sources of financing, and the ratio of equity to total financing sources, but only for big firms. So it appears that an increase in monetary growth reduces, in a sense, the need for debt or equity financing in the case of big firms. If we look at the case of small firms, the ones with stars there, an increase in lagged monetary growth increased short-term debt, as well as the ratio of short-term to long-term debt, and only in the case of small firms. So this is the same result as the one I obtained earlier when I looked at all firms. The coefficient on monetary growth for the ratio of short-term to long-term debt is negative, but not significant for big firms. So what these results imply is that even when monetary growth increases, small firms can borrow, but they do so with debt of shorter maturity, whereas in general, total debt declines and the ratio of short-term debt to total sources of financing decline in the case of big firms. Okay, so this is similar to the earlier finding, in which there seems to be a tilt towards shorter tenors of debt for small firms, even when monetary growth is growing, rather than, there's an increase in the lag policy rate, which is what we found when we used all firms. So there seems to be, at least in terms of tenor of debt, small firms tend to have higher ratios of short-term debt relative to long-term debt and or to total sources of financing. So in the case of the lag policy rate, it reduces the amount of short-term debt for all firms and big firms, and reduces the ratio of long-term debt to total financing for big firms only. Okay, but an increase in the policy rate increases the long-term debt of small firms and only small firms. So this may indicate this finding for the lag policy rate in the food beverage sector is different from the overall finding using all firms, because here the tenor of debt for small firms, long-term debt actually increases. Okay. All right, so if I look at lag reserve requirement, it has a positive effect on the increase or decrease of the amount of short-term borrowing for big firms. However, most of the effects fall on small firms. So there are three variables here impacted, three variables of small firms impacted. Total debt and the ratio of long-term borrowing to total sources of financing increase, while retained earnings decline in the case of small firms, and suggesting that small firms can borrow at longer terms and utilize more of their retained earnings, while big firms tend to borrow more at shorter terms when the reserve requirement ratio increases. So in general, the two policy instruments, policy rate and the reserve requirement ratio, seem to work in a way to shift longer long-term debt towards small firms and away from big firms who take up more short-term debt. So it's kind of the reverse of what we found in the general case. So real estate, the findings for the real estate firms are interesting in the sense that look at what, policy rate and loan growth are really important. And then monetary growth is the next important one, and the reserve requirement, not so. Okay, so this is very interesting, the loan growth thing. It has the greatest number of effects on the financing variables of small firms. Okay, so this is the slide with the most number of stars indicating an impact on the financing variables of small firms. Cash, long-term borrowings, total debt, long-term debt, retained earnings, reduction in long-term debt, and the ratio of long-term borrowing to total sources of financing all increase for all firms, big firms and small firms, when loan growth increases. So this is a sector where apparently, sources of financing are plentiful, even for small firms when loan growth increases. So loan growth tends to have more universal effects because it affects both big and small firms. But here, as I mentioned, even small firms take on more debt and long-term borrowing when loan growth increases. And the effects of lagged loan growth on the financing variables of big and small firms, particularly long-term debt and long-term borrowing, are opposite those found for the lagged policy rate. So if I look at the lagged policy rate, it reduces total debt and long-term debt for all three types of firms. It implies that big firms' total debt and long-term debt are very sensitive to the lagged policy rate, and both the net proceeds from issuance of stock and the ratio of proceeds of issuance of common and preferred stock to total sources of financing are negatively affected by for all firms and for small firms. And these results suggest that small firms in particular have difficulty in sourcing funds from the issuance of stocks when credit conditions tighten, and no other effects on the financing variables of small firms are found. So in the case of big firms, long-term debt and long-term borrowing as sources of financing for big firms are particularly affected by an increase in the lagged policy rate. It slows down the reduction in long-term debt. The ratio of long-term borrowing to total sources of financing, and the ratio of long-term debt to total sources of financing. Okay. All right. So for lagged monetary growth, an effect on big firms alone is an increase. That an increase in lagged monetary growth increases the ratio of short-term debt to total sources of financing. Okay. Okay, so here you see that. So when there's an increase in monetary growth, lagged, you see that there is an increase in the ratio of short-term debt to total sources of financing. And in general, it appears that there's a shift. It appears that lagged monetary growth tends to shift debt towards short-term rather than long-term financing for big firms. And this is not a desirable outcome, because you could have the formation of asset bubbles. And there are also effects that apply only to small firms. So an increase in lagged monetary growth slows the reduction in long-term debt and reduces the proceeds from the issuance of common and preferred shares by small firms. So in contrast with the results for big firms, small firms do not seem to be able to access more debt, even short-term, when monetary growth increases. They also experience a reduction in the proceeds of stock issuance. For lag reserve requirement, this increase in the lag reserve requirement increases long-term debt and decreases retained earnings for all firms and slows the reduction in long-term debt for all firms and big firms only. Some of these results are opposite those of the lag policy rate, but the effect of slowing down the reduction in long-term debt is the same. Okay, so finally, you have construction firms, and here, curiously, well, not so curiously, loan growth is also the most important thing, but then so is the reserve requirement, lag reserve requirement, which was not the case for the other sectors. Okay, usually reserve requirement has and here, well, policy rate is still fairly affects financing variables. Monetary growth, not so much, but this is the one that's surprising for this sector. For some reason, the reserve requirement, the lag reserve requirement is important. It reduces long-term borrowing, increases the reduction in long-term debt, reduces the ratio of long-term borrowing to total sources of financing, and increases the ratio of cash to total sources of financing for small firms. So in general, an increase in the lag reserve requirement ratio reduces debt, actually, for both types of firms, which seemingly, with effects seemingly affecting long-term debt in the case of small firms and short-term debt in the case of big firms. So, to make a long story short, let me summarize by saying that in general, what I find is that the lag policy rate and the lag loan growth rate are more often than not the most important variables that affect the financing or financial variables of firms. The reserve requirement ratio was oftentimes the least important variable affecting the financial variables of firms, except in the case of the construction sector. There are differences in the effects of monetary policy tools, as well as the effect of lag monetary growth and lag loan growth in these financing variables of the firms. And the effects of these different explanatory variables differ across sectors and across firms classified by firm size. In almost all cases, the effects on the financial variables of big firms are many times larger than that on small firms. And in many cases, the financial variables of small firms are not at all significantly affected by the policy tools of the central bank. Loan growth and monetary growth tend to affect the financing behavior of big and small firms more universally than do monetary policy tools, meaning the policy rate and the reserve requirement ratio, although there are some differences in the tenor of debt that big versus small firms can access. The real estate sector is unique in that loan growth and the policy tools affect the financing behavior of both big and small firms, okay? Both big and small firms. And I think one important insight for policy is that while monetary policy tools work in the right direction in terms of affecting overall money and credit conditions and can be used as macroprudential measures, especially in the real estate sector, they do not appear sufficient to systematically affect financing decisions or the financial variables of small firms, nor remove this bias in favor of big firms seen in things like access to credit, to debt at all, or to debt with longer term tenors. Loan growth, rather than monetary policy variables per se, on the whole, appears to be more important in affecting the financial options and decisions of firms, particularly small firms. And so, how to make monetary policy foster more inclusive growth by easing financial constraints and broadening financing options of small firms, to me, remains an important policy issue for inclusive growth. So that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Ma'am Corina, for that very meticulous analysis of the effect of different monetary policy shocks, in particular, the growth of the policy rate, loan growth, monetary growth, and the reserve requirement on 20 financial variables of small and large firms in various sectors. And one particular result that struck me was that result for the small firms, which is
Yes.
broadly consistent with the literature on especially several evidence from the current COVID-19 crisis, which suggests that small firms would rather first sell their assets when struck with a shock, rather than go to banks or other credit institutions. So, right. So the virtual floor is now open for questions for Ma'am Corina.
Just to react to your observation, Adrian, the data set I used, as I mentioned, consists of listed firms. And so, even my crude classification of big versus small firms, among firms that are listed, I'm pretty sure the small firms here in this data set are probably still much larger relative to some of the firms that you're talking about, right? So one challenge is really to find data for in particular for these small enterprises, small and medium enterprises, rather than many of whom may not be listed. So to get a real a better picture of what is happening to small firms.
So, Ma'am, your data ended in 2019. So would
Right.
will you be updating your science?
I don't think we have. I'm not sure if we renewed our subscription to DataStream. If the thing is, if I update it now, I'll probably have 2 more data points, and they will be outliers. So then there's, I think we have to wait a few years really to get more observations to be able to do a study on the COVID effect, because you have to tease out the COVID effect. I've seen many ways of doing that in the literature. Trina Ng has a series of papers on how to do it, and it's to actually de-COVID the data. All right, so it's not just putting a dummy variable there for a change in the slope or whatever of this data series, right? So
yeah. Okay, we have a question from Dr. Laura Fermo. Ma'am Laura, do you want to ask your question directly to Ma'am Corina?
Sige. Sorry, napakarami kong props.
Well,
Maybe
I can't see you though, Laura. Your
yeah,
video's
well,
not on.
I turned it on, but you won't be seeing me because of all these coverings.
I know. Okay.
But um, siguro, I actually sent the question to Doc Mendoza via chat. Siguro nahabaan po siya. So I'll be the one na lang to ask the
Sige,
question,
okay.
if I may. Your research paper and the results are definitely very interesting. And I find it even more interesting because this is the approach you utilized in the study is very similar to the kind of approach we do when we want to identify the bank lending channel, whereby we use panel regression and then see whether bank characteristics affect bank lending differently. And so, in a sense, that's also why you mentioned this, that you included macro variables on the right hand side in order to purge the demand side effects and ensure that what you're capturing are supply side effects. So I was
Mhm.
wondering, Ma'am Corina, would it be also interesting, or is it also useful if we like introduce interactive variables between the macro variables you indicated, especially those four variables, and the individual explanatory variables you have on your right hand side? Because I remember in the approach for the identification of the bank lending channel, the interactive variable between the monetary policy variable, for example, and the bank characteristics sort of helps not only purge demand side effects even further and ensure that you're isolating supply side effects, but at the same time, the information of how whether the bank characteristics attenuates or whether it sort of makes monetary policy or amplifies the effects of monetary policies. Interesting. I wonder if in this approach or in this particular study, there is a role for such interactive variables. And second po na pahabol na tanong, I was wondering po kasi sa bank identification of the bank lending channel, it also became apparent that it's important to also distinguish not only between big firms and small firms, but also between foreign affiliated or MNCs in this case for the firms that are listed and those that are purely domestic. I don't know if if among the listed firms, I'm assuming there are some which are purely
Yeah.
domestic kasi 'di ba po
Yeah.
magkaiba rin yung impact ng monetary policy changes and those other variables when they have a direct link to a foreign branch or a foreign partner, for example. Thank you po, yun lang.
Okay, Laura, to answer your first question first, I
Yes.
think obviously interaction effects are always interesting, and in fact, the 2014 paper on that I cited that two co-authors and I published in World Development. Looks at the effect of financial development and financial constraints, and we interact those with cash sensitivity of the firms to investment demand, and we find some very interesting results doing this having these interactive variables. But I think there is a prior question to yours, which is if you're trying, there are two possible research questions in your first question. The first research question is there a bank lending channel or not? Okay, that's one research question. The other research question is what factors drive the bank lending channel? Okay, so those are two distinct questions, research questions embedded in your question about whether we should have interactive variables there. Because if you want to find first answer the question, is there a bank lending channel, then you have to find ways to ensure that you're capturing changes in the supply of bank loans as a result of a monetary policy shock, rather than a change in the demand for bank loans, right? And then, as in one of the papers that I cited, if, what really is the bank lending channel, or is there bank lending channel? Because what they found was that banks, big firms are not dependent on bank loans very much for financing investment. And when monetary policy is contractionary, what happens is the banks actually shift lending to small firms, and then the big firms simply don't borrow, and it doesn't look like there's a decline. The banks lend away from small firms towards large firms. The large firms are not so dependent on bank loans. So bumabagsak yung bank loans as a result of contractionary policy, but that's not the bank lending channel, right?
Opo.
Right? So the first thing you have to establish is whether there is a bank lending channel or not. The second related research question is, if you have established that there is a bank lending channel, then what are the variables that drive the bank lending channel? Is it certain bank characteristics or characteristics of firms that drive the bank lending channel? Okay, so does a firm being a big versus small affect the supply of bank loans? Does a firm being profitable or not affect the supply of bank loans? Does the bank, certain bank characteristics, if the bank itself is not profitable, or something, its return on assets was not very good the previous year, is there something, does that affect the supply of bank loans? So those are two related questions to this bank lending channel that you're talking about, which precede, to my mind, the question that you're asking about whether you should interact, policy variables with other variables in that kind of a study. So and since you're at the central bank, actually, really, the best way to study whether a bank lending channel or not exists, and how this bank lending channel works through its effects, is to use administrative data. In other words, you know which banks lend to which firms, and you know how much each of these firms borrow from different banks. And you know the tenor at which they borrow. You know whether banks are giving them lines of credit or not, in good times and in bad. And so the other way to approach the question that I've been trying to answer here, which is how financing decisions are affected, is to look at the liquidity management of firms, of their balance sheets. In other words, what happens, what is the degree of substitutability between bank loans and other forms of financing, including issuing stock, using cash, retained earnings, etc. So that's kind of where I'm headed in terms of this research is concerned. But as far as a study on the bank lending channel at the central bank, I would really go to SES and get administrative data, because then you can really see, what's happening to not only the supply of loans to big versus small firms, or without even knowing which are big and which are small firms, which firms are affected how, whenever there's a monetary policy shock. The tenor of lending, whether credit lines are extended, whether there's more forbearance on existing loans, things like that. I think that should be the aim, actually, of somebody at the BSP who sincerely wants to study bank lending channel and how, why is it that even if 2.3 trillion pesos worth of liquidity is pumped in, loan growth doesn't expand very much. So if you have the data there, I think you should go for the data first and think about, answering these questions sequentially. I think your question is valid, but to me, it's of sort of lower. It's a lower level of importance in answering very constructively and precisely the question of, is there really a bank lending channel? How does it work? And looking at the degree of substitutability amongst these different, and then, do a study on, okay, if there's a bank lending channel, what are the factors that affect the existence of a bank lending channel? Then you look at bank characteristics, you look at characteristics of the firms, you look at, macro variables, VIX, inflation growth, etc., in the economy. Now, what was your second question? I forgot.
Sorry po. Well, only if it also be interesting and useful to, well, for me, I think it would be, but I'm not so sure your view on this, but to also sort of distinguish between foreign
the
affiliated
foreign,
firms, MNCs
yes,
versus domestic. Opo.
absolutely, yeah. I mean, that question, I was asked that question also. If you could, in fact, it wasn't ownership, kung may foreign or purely domestic ownership of firms. It was whether the firm was an exporter or not.
Opo. I think
So
that's
I mean,
another,
it's the same kind of flavor, but I think if you have data like that, that tells you whether the firm has any kind of foreign ownership or foreign tie-up, or whether it's it's a subsidiary of a foreign firm, or whether it's an exporter or not. I think those are, again, part of the characteristics of firms that may affect the willingness of banks to lend to them. Definitely. Yeah, if you had that kind of data, for sure you should use it. But, again, Laura, I think you're at the central bank. You should really find this data. I'm sure they're there, it's really hard there.
Yeah, I understand completely. And well, on the first in the first step that you pointed out earlier po, that we need to first identify the bank lending channel. On that side, because the financial reporting package available even for BSP researchers would have that data in terms of levels of lending per bank and all the bank characteristics. However, the admin side of it, and in fact, I do have a forthcoming paper on this, but I just need to update, but for publication. But for the next step, and which is related to your particular research, is looking at the administrative data. It's something that's equally difficult for BSP researchers within the BSP, at least, but outside of SES, because this is proprietary data, and especially because of data privacy, then it's even more complicated. But the basic principle being applied for BSP researchers is that we are allowed to look into bank level data on an anonymized
that's
level.
fine.
So
that's fine.
That's fine, because we're not really reporting or describing
correct
on a per bank or per firm.
Yes. I mean, it's a little ridiculous if even people in the BSP, or specifically in SES, cannot work with the bank level data they have, hindi
Opo.
ba?
Well, SES, yes. I think they
Well,
are
then you should
more.
move to SES if you want to do this kind of research.
No, well, at the BSP Research Academy, we have Dr. Oni Bayangos. So she came from SPRD, and but again, for as long as we treat it on
Yeah, I mean,
being
they can
anonymized, then
anonymize it,
that's
you know.
fine.
But
Yeah.
I remember I mentioned this to Governor Jokno the first week he was in office, and Philip Medalla and Bruce Tolentino were
Opo.
there, and of course Bruce agreed with me, and but then Philip said, even if you anonymize the data here, because there are only a few big banks, people will know which bank it
You
is.
can guess, yeah. At least
I don't
the
know.
top 10. At least the top 10,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
You're right.
But I mean, I don't know. Are the top 10 so I mean, I think they're practically the same naman eh. I don't think you can
Yeah.
really say, which one's BPI and which one
Opo.
is BDO there.
Opo. Okay,
But
thank you.
anyways,
Thank you, Ma'am
yun lang.
Corina.
You're welcome.
Para yung
Salamat
ibang
po,
questions
Nora.
po.
Sige.
There's another question from an anonymous sender
Okay.
via the chat box.
Hmm.
Hi, Dr. Guchoco Bautista, great presentation and findings. I noticed that the framework used was OLS funnel regression, if I remember it correctly. However, may I respectfully ask if you also considered VAR, or in order to see the impulse response of monetary policy shocks to firm level financing decisions, or will this be considered in your paper?
No, I didn't consider using a VAR because what I really just wanted to find out here was which of these monetary policy tools, as well as loan growth and monetary growth, would have a significant effect on. I wasn't interested in looking at the impulse response. I mean, to begin with, it's complicated enough to do the panel OLS when I'm missing data and all that. And I was thinking, why not use GMM? But then I thought that's even harder because I don't know what instruments to use. So I used lagged explanatory variables na lang so that I don't have an endogeneity problem, no? But I didn't consider VAR.
Okay, so I think that answers your question to our anonymous sender.
Yeah, because I just wanted to know which of these different policy shocks, policy tools, as well as loan growth and monetary growth affect the I was less concerned about the the dynamic impact over time of a shock in monetary. What I was concerned with was finding out whether which of the financing variables they affect. Yun.
Thanks, Ma'am Corina. So, any more questions from the audience? So, by the way, kanina, you were talking about MNCs. And usually, tuhog po yan eh. MNCs are large firms, which are also exporters. So, sometimes when you control for their foreign affiliation, nakaka-capture na rin yung ibang effects. For example, yung size and their exporting status.
Yeah, you have access to that big data set, diba, Adrian?
Ano po kasi yan, you have to go to PSA to access the data. The firm.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that the financial data will be there. Ano ba yung data yun is more like employment, mga ganon, di ba?
Right, mga balance sheet data set.
Merong balance sheet?
Certain fields on the operations of the firms.
Kasi what I want to do next, my next paper is really sort of turns this question of big versus small and financing constraints of small firms versus big firms on its head by looking at how how firms manage their balance sheets, liquidity management of balance sheets, without pre-specifying whether that firm is financially constrained or not. In other words, I want the data to tell me whether a firm, regardless of size, is financially constrained or not, meaning that it cannot invest, in a profitable investment, a project with a net present value that's positive at the given interest rate and given its sources of external finance. So I want the data, because there's the literature here, the traditional literature, Vasari, Hubbard, for example, says that firms are financially constrained, and therefore they manage their balance sheets in a way that their cash holdings become very volatile, no? Because they're externally constrained. Whenever there's a boom and bust, or a good opportunity and a bust in the economy, they adjust by adjusting their cash holdings, because they're financially constrained. If you're not financially constrained, then this liquidity management business is moot. Actually, there's no reason for you to manage your balance sheet liquidity that way, so actively, if you can always borrow from external sources, right? So it's that kind of thinking that I want to use. Look at the cash sensitivity, or the volatility of cash holdings of firms, and also then look at the other source of financing, in order to classify which firms are financially constrained and which ones aren't. So it's going from the end to the beginning, I don't pre-specify big and small financially constrained or not. I look at how they're behaving in terms of liquidity management to figure out which firms are likely financially constrained. Because if they're not financially constrained, they don't have to manage their cash balances so actively. So that's where I'm headed.
Right. So that means you have to keep your contacts with BSP.
I don't know. I don't know. Dami ka ng utang sa BSP. 2 taon na yata akong hindi nag-lecture. Hindi, last year nag-lecture ako, but before that, hindi ako nag-lecture. So, yeah.
So, probably we have time for one more question from the audience. Or,
some of my students are here. Okay.
Yeah. Or,
nandito rin si Jade. Si Ferdy. Si Lily.
So alternatively, you can type in your question via the chat box anonymously.
Don't be scared. You can tell me who you are.
So, ma'am, what other sorts of information are found in the data stream data set?
It's just really the financial statements of the of listed firms. Yun lang, basically. I think the Orbis data set has information on ownership, kung foreign or domestic. But it's very hard to match up different data sets like that, no? It doesn't have, for example, information on the amount of bank loans by firm. And that's really critical if you want to do a study on the lending channel, right? Bank lending channel. So the bank firm level data have data on the amount of loans they give out, but the firm level, the non-bank firm level data do not have data on the amount of bank loans they have.
So you're saying that, let's say across data stream or Orbis, it is possible, but it is hard to match data.
Yeah, it's hard to match data. And well, that's why I was telling Laura that all of these data, administrative data that matches banks to borrowers, those are all at the central bank. It's really a pity if the data are there and they're not used. Because a lot of the questions that we have about how do we actually expand loan growth, how do we help the small and medium firms, and maybe the small and medium firms don't really show up in the bank loan data, but I don't know where to get this data. Maybe SEC, I don't know. But I don't know if the SEC data will have bank loan data by firm. So most of the studies that I've seen of this type use data from the central bank. So presumably it exists. Because if the bank reports loans given to all its clients, yun lang nga, we're not sure if the small firms are really shut out of the formal banking sector. We don't know.
Right.
So baka hindi mo rin ma-capture yung small firms doon.
So would you say that's probably the reason why, for example, policy rate and reserve requirement are less important for the small firms?
Yeah, sa kanila talaga ano lang eh. But if even loan growth, with the exception of firms in the real estate sector, don't allow alternative options for financing, it's parang it's hard to establish that in the case of small firms in general.
Okay, so I guess wala nang questions from the audience. By the way, may I request everyone to turn on their cameras for a photo op?
I can't eh. The host has stopped it. Post.
Kailangan may picture eh.
Si Camille lang dapat pala. Camille.
Kayo lang ang may picture.
Ayan, naka-on na kayo.
Okay. Sige. Nako.
Alright.
Buhay pala. Naman,
So Camille from
Dora
Tinagal ko lang po muna.
Take the picture.
Sorry sa mga kasama ko.
Camille.
So do we have everyone? Gallery view. Oh, it's just us.
Kasi kailangan din to panelist. Medyo Oh, Camille, turn on your camera if you're there.
Oo nga, so it's not a black spot there. Oh, hi Camille. I haven't seen you in so long.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Allowed mag-on ang camera if attendees lang po in a webinar. Time po, we can do it in a Zoom meeting po if we want the attendees.
I see. Okay. Well, you're going to have to represent all the attendees then. Sige.
All right. Thank you. Yes, Dr.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Camille. And thank you for everyone who attended. Bye, all. Salamat.
Stay safe. Thank you,
You too.
Martina.
Thanks everyone. Have a nice weekend. Thank you.